Hi everyone, my name's Nadine Newkirk. You are listening to the Psychology of Dating podcast, and I'm both a clinical psychologist and a dating coach. And for today's episode, I'm really excited to introduce a guest speaker, Georgia Grace. She's a certified sex and relationship practitioner and somatic therapist. Quite a mouthful.
Yeah, lots of S's in there, and they're hard to jump over.
Mm-hmm. And Georgia and I, we met at a UNSW event for college students. It was a Sextember event where they had a whole month of different talks and workshops all around learning about relationships, sex, consent. And we each presented a talk on the same night, and then we're on a panel together. And yeah, I was really excited to get to know Georgia and welcome her on my podcast. And as a first question, so maybe some people aren't familiar with what a relationship practitioner or somatic therapist does. You tell us a little bit about your work.
Yeah, great question. So, my training is in somatic sexology. So, to break down those two words, somatic, soma is the Latin word for of the body. So, it's anytime we use the body to understand the mind or the emotions. There are a lot of somatic practices out there, and over the years, it's been getting a lot more attention because there's been more research into these body-based practices for working with things like trauma, for understanding emotions, for regulating how we're feeling, but also for experiencing more pleasure in our bodies. Because, of course, when we're having sex, we're using our bodies, we're in our bodies. Then sexology is the scientific study of sex. So I guess the way that I like to break that down is the awareness of both top-down and bottom-up approaches. So your classic psychologists or counselors will often work with a top-down approach. So it's often working with the mind, understanding the narrative or the thoughts or the feelings. Of course, I know you're well across that, and I'm sure everyone who listens to this podcast is too. We're really familiar with this approach and this way of working. But then bottom-up approach is anytime we address what's going on in the body to understand the mind or the thoughts or the narrative. So I work loosely with both a top-down and a bottom-up approach. How that sort of is structured into my week, I'm in session 2 days a week, and I work with individuals and couples. And then I do a few other things on the side. So I also have a podcast. I've just written a book that came out in October 2024, and it's out there now for anyone who wants to buy it. And I'm the co-founder of Normal, which is a sex toy company, essentially.
Wow, amazing. So people know what's the name of your podcast and book, and could you tell us a little bit, I mean, it's just been released, could you tell us a little bit about what the book's about?
Yeah, I basically did the 101 of not promoting my book very well. I didn't give the name of it. So the book is called The Modern Guide to Sex. And basically it's split into 3 sections. It starts off with understanding the self, and then it goes into section 2, which is all about relationships. And the third section is all about further exploration. This is based on my 8 years of working in practice, and it's a combination of sex education, coaching elements. There's also therapeutic approaches, there's case studies and stories, and dozens of tools and practices. The way I've written the book is to support people in learning by doing. So I think that often people want the information, they want the research, they want the ideas, they want the theory, and that's all in there. But the way that I like to work is also supporting people in going out to explore it on their own and to apply it to their life or relationships or sex. So yeah, it's also fully illustrated and it's color. People are often saying that it's a really beautiful coffee table book that they're really proud to keep out, which I was kind of surprised at how beautiful it was when I got it, the first copy. I was like, oh my gosh, it's actually a really beautiful, fun book to read. So yeah, it's written for all people, all genders, all sexualities, and I really do think all people should buy this book because just none of us were given sex ed. None of us have been taught, and I guess I kind of wanted to create a book that supported people in getting the information we all really desperately want and need. And then Glad You Came is my podcast, and that is essentially I speak with a range of different experts around their ideas or experiences in working with sex. So it's like I guess a conversational podcast.
Mm. Wow, yeah, I totally agree that we weren't given the information around sex and consent, and I was actually quite envious of the college students at the talk we gave. So I
Yeah.
thought, man, I really
Yes.
wish I had this month of, these speakers and all this knowledge, and our talks were just 10 minutes each, but I took multiple screenshots of yours because I just thought, wow, this is going to be so helpful to so many people that I see. Um, it's like quite a minefield when you think about going to sex because you've got relationships and you already have all your dynamics and you're bringing in romantic relationships often trigger things from your family life and your parents, so you've got all these unconscious dynamics happening there, and then you've just learnt things from TV or movies which don't often really show realistic ways of relating in sex or how to communicate what you need. And then you've also got heightened feelings because you're dating and maybe you're extra anxious, or so to be able to even know what skills to use if you haven't learned them, you don't know what the toolbox is. I think it's so important that actually people can have it broken down.
And that's what I really liked about your talk too, because I think that there's this assumption when it comes to dating that we should all just get it. And that's very isolating. And a lot of people feel very broken or abnormal when they realize I find dating challenging. And because there is this thing that it's like, oh, you're a young person or you're a single person. If you want to go out and meet someone, just go and do it. Let yourself shine through and you'll find the one for you, quote unquote, the one. But it's hard. And we all bring, as you were saying, like our past sort of ideas around relationships to dating, or of course, like our past traumas or the things that feel or make it that much more nerve-wracking to go into a new dynamic with this person. So yeah, even just having those 5 tools that you shared or the 5 steps that you shared I was like, oh, if only everyone had access to this.
Yeah, it should be like a mandatory course before you go onto Tinder or
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
to do
Yeah, you
it.
should tell them that. Get in touch
Yeah.
with Tinder.
Um, I had a couple of questions I was thinking about, common themes that I've had clients tell me and relating to the area of sex. And one of them was when someone's so focused on pleasuring the other person and like performance anxiety that they then really can't enjoy it themselves, or they find it hard to get to an orgasm, or they might then be apprehensive about even, starting, some more intimacy with the person they're dating. Is that something
Yeah.
that you've come across or?
Yes, this is such a big concern or, point of anxiety for people. I think that there's this idea that to be a good lover, you have to be able to make that other person climax. Or you have to be able to give them these leg trembling, orgasms or this mind blowing experience. And I think in theory, that's a really great way to approach sex, that I'm going into sex and I want to make sure this other person has a great time. I think that does make you a good lover if you're interested in their pleasure as well. And I think we should all be interested in the other person or the other people's pleasure. However, we also need to bring our awareness to the pressure that might be putting on people, in that, saying things like, I just want to make you come, or have you come yet, or even like, why is it taking so long? These things can put a huge amount of pressure on the person who's receiving, take them out of their body and out of the experience, and make them feel like they're not good at receiving, and they start to think that their pleasure is all about the person that's giving it to them. And that's when I'll hear things from the other side, where they'll say, I'll fake an orgasm because I don't want to make my partner feel uncomfortable, or I don't want to make them feel insecure, or because I couldn't climax, I thought there was something wrong with me, so it just felt easier to fake it. So whilst in theory it's really great to want to give your partner pleasure, we must be aware of the pressure that can put on other people, but also the pressure it can put on you, because someone's orgasm says nothing about how good the experience was. Because when I ask clients, why does sex feel good for you, or why are you drawn to sex? Sure, people will mention orgasm because it's fun to orgasm, but they will say other things like exploration and connection, because they get to transcend the mundane, because they want to feel good with this person, because they're in love with them, because they want to try something new. So there are a lot of different things that draw us to sex, and there are a lot of different things that we will identify as being really fulfilling. That's not just about orgasm. And I think, maybe to answer your question more directly, when we feel pressure, we're not in the moment. When we feel that, like that sense that we need to be performing, it's rare that we will feel really good, because then we're not in our bodies and we're in our head. And when we're in our head, we can experience more stress and anxiety around sex as well. So a lot of the work I do is finding ways that couples or individuals can remove the pressure from sex.
Yeah, just thinking about how if someone has like a broken record looping thought, like, oh, I'm not finishing quick enough, I need to hurry up, how that could then trigger fight, flight, like anxiety feelings. And then, that's the complete opposite of being able to kind of relax into the moment and connect with the person they're with. And and that's where, when you're talking about people being able to practice and like body-based practice, I think that's so important, because often in our culture there is a lot of emphasis on the head and the cognitive part, and not as much on getting into your body and listening to that.
Yeah, and that's why I think we are seeing more sex therapists or sexologists getting on board with the somatic awareness and the somatic practices, because they're realizing that there's only so much that they can do with the thoughts and feelings. Like, they actually need to start bringing awareness to the body, because as you were saying, people do identify that they might feel their heart racing, or they might feel their eyes darting around, or they might feel this urge to like get up and run away, and they are embodied responses. So we kind of must address that if we're wanting to work with bringing them back to the present moment. And I'm curious if you notice this, but often what I'll hear is when people are just working with the thoughts alone, that can actually trigger more anxiety, because then they go down the spiral, or they go down that sort of loop, and then they try to bring in the CBT, and they try to reframe the thinking, but they still feel anxious in their body. What do you notice that with your clients?
Definitely, yeah. It can, and it can also start to be, I guess, a bit more like almost trying to work on the thoughts as just like a formula or a mathematics. Okay, I do this step, I do that step. And then that completely takes them away from being more spontaneous or in the moment, or really listening to, okay, that time I was with this person, this felt good, but now this time something else might feel good, or I don't feel like it today. And if there's this idea of, okay, this happens and that happens, kind of like a movie plot that's always ends the same, it really can take them out of the moment and miss some connection.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's where sex ed comes in as well, because perhaps these ideas around the narrative of sex we've learnt from movies and porn, or really great stories that our friends tell us.
I'm just watching Mad Men at the moment, and thinking about the lessons that people get there. It's very
I actually haven't watched Mad Men, but I can imagine it's very like burst into a door and like roll around and rip clothes off and penetration straight away, and they both come at the same time.
Heterosexual couple. It's
Okay. And looking at that, particularly for heterosexual couples, one thing that I really like to share with everyone is that when we're looking at arousal,
Mm-hmm.
looking at someone with a penis, their arousal can happen within a few seconds or a few minutes. Like they can get an erection relatively quickly. But then looking at someone with a vulva, it can take them much longer, 20 to 40 minutes, to be fully physiologically aroused. That doesn't mean that they can't climax within a few minutes. I mean, many people with vulvas, many women do climax within a few minutes, especially if they're using a toy or if they're getting the stimulation, or maybe that's just how their body works. But
Mm-hmm.
it is more common for women and people with vulvas to take longer. And because this narrative that we've all seen, because it looks good on screen,
Mm-hmm.
it happens within a few seconds or minutes. A lot of women and people with vulvas are looking at that and thinking, why am I not wet and engorged and feeling a whole lot of pleasure within 30 seconds?
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we need to start to bring in this education, which is a penis and a vulva aren't the same. There are certain things that are similar, but the arousal response can be quite different. And that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean there's anything wrong with someone with a vulva. It just means we need to redefine the ways that we're understanding sex and bring in more outer course, so stimulation, external stimulation. The majority of people with vulvas will not climax from penetration alone. They need external and perhaps internal, but the majority of people with vulvas will climax from external stimulation. So if they're just having penetrative sex, they're probably not going to climax unless they have,
Mm-hmm.
stimulation of their clit at some point. So yeah, it's this education that I think like I can see it in session when we talk through it, and it's like a light bulb moment for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see the relief in their bodies because they think, oh, okay, I'm not broken. I've just been having sex in the way that it's been modeled to me, which is in a TV show,
Mm-hmm.
rather than having sex in a way that is following what's present in our bodies in the moment.
Mm. And wow, I didn't even know that knowledge of,
Yeah.
that it can take up to 45
Mhm.
minutes, for someone with a vulva. And, that's, I'm working in the field of therapy, and it just blows my mind that actually this knowledge isn't out there already.
Yes.
I'm really curious about like the science behind that. What goes on?
Okay, so if you can see, so I've got this model of a vulva, and you can see the clitoris and sort of the external parts. But when we take this part off, it then shows us the internal model, and we can see. Have you seen this model of the clitoris before?
No, I've never seen the internal. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So often what we think the external glands of the clitoris are seen to be like a bean-like structure. So that's when someone says they're flicking the bean, that's kind of what they're talking about. But the clitoris actually extends into the body. So it goes into sort of a shaft that we can see here, and then that extends into legs or crura, and then into vestibular bulbs. So when the clitoris is not aroused, when there's no arousal, it looks a lot smaller. This is an example of it being sort of engorged and erect. So the more aroused you are, the more blood flow, the more engorged, the more erect it is. And that's why it starts to feel more pleasurable and sensitive. And if you're taking time to build arousal, that can also support with things like lubrication.
Mm-hmm.
So lubrication can come from the vagina, so internally, and with more arousal, obviously, and with more lubrication, that can feel more pleasurable to stimulate. However, a lot of people will also say that they would need something like lube, and using lube can also help with sensation, help with feeling good. But in recent years, Dr. Helen O'Connell, who is an Australian urologist, she has been the first person to fully map the clitoris. And what she found is that
Wow,
actually,
that only just happened recently.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So for the dates to be exact, I'm pretty sure it was 1998 was
Mm-hmm.
one of her studies, and then she did more work on it and refined it. I think it was in 2017.
Mm.
If I've got those dates incorrect, I'm sorry, but from memory, I'm pretty sure it's that. And so what she found was that actually the G spot is part of the clitoral network. So when you are stimulating internally, you will feel like the more aroused you are, the more the G spot will protrude from the vaginal wall. So this takes time. It takes time for that to feel more sensitive. And when you're not aroused, if you were to rub your tongue on the roof of your mouth, that's what the G spot feels like when you're not aroused. And if you are aroused, if you were to rub your tongue on the side of your cheek, that's what it feels like when you are aroused. So yeah, the more time, the more blood flow, the more engorgement, the more lubrication. And there's also been some interesting research or MRIs into understanding this. And when babies are in utero, the genital makeup looks pretty similar. And as you're looking at a clitoris, you can kind of see the similarities to a penis as well. So we've got like the head, which is similar to the head of the penis, and we've got the shaft, and then we've got the bulbs here, which also kind of look like the testes. So whilst it is different, or look similar, there are certain differences in that this network is all inside the body and the penis hangs outside of the body. So yeah, we kind of need to take more time to allow for that arousal as well. That's kind of where my mind went with speaking about the science of it today. There's obviously so much more to it as well.
Fascinating.
Yeah. But yeah, this model is really interesting. If you're wanting more information on this, I actually do cover this in the book, but this model is called the clitoris model. So for any practitioners who are listening to, they may want to look into that as well.
And that made me think of that's helpful education for someone who has a vulva to take the pressure off themselves, but also for someone, like who's partnered with someone, that they feel less pressure, like, oh, they're not aroused yet, what's wrong with me? It also takes the pressure off them as well. It really just allows people to go slowly and, not put this some ticking time clock. It has to be like in the movies, 30 seconds, otherwise we're both failures.
Yes. Yeah. And what I hear a lot from people with vulvas is that actually it feels more pleasurable when they do things like teasing or not going directly to the clitoris straight away. So moving around the outside of the vulva first, really slowly taking your time to get there to allow for that arousal to build. And then also sort of starting slower and building up. So for some people, when they're not aroused, direct clitoral stimulation can feel uncomfortable, intense, or painful. So often when I hear that, I think, okay, they probably need to be taking more time to build arousal. Of course, that's not the case for everyone, because then I will also have women and people with vulvas be like, I don't want you to take time. I want it to be quick. I really like the intensity of it. And if anyone's listening and they relate to that, great. That's also normal. But what I guess we're working with here is for anyone who's feeling like it's not feeling that great, and they're not feeling the pleasure or sensation that they want or need. Perhaps it is all about taking more time before there's direct clit stimulation.
I was just having a thought about, do you have any tips for people to be able to express what they want while they're having sex? So I know that's a really big challenge. And, one, to be able to speak up and say, I like this over this, because it's fear of maybe hurting the other person, or to be able to say, like, no, I don't like that. But, sometimes people feel like they'll kill the mood or, because I remember in your talk, you had some really good practical kind of statements or things to practice. And I was wondering if you could share some of those.
Yes, of course. So first thing I will do is I'll get clear on what's getting in the way of them asking for what they need, because we kind of need to address that first. And there are many things that will get in the way. You mentioned a few: killing the mood, the fear that it will offend their partner, not knowing what they can ask for, not knowing how to ask for it, thinking that if I ask it and then I get it and I don't like it, then I'll have to tell them that I don't like it. So there's so many things. And then there's also sort of bigger things like the culture of shame and taboo or slut shaming around sex. So we really get a sense of that. And for anyone listening, maybe feeling into that question, what is stopping me from voicing what I want or need? Then we will always practice outside of sex, because sex is vulnerable. And if you've never communicated, it's, I would say, a pretty unfair thing to then expect you to go ahead and be really descriptive with what you want. And I find that a lot of my clients aren't talking about a lot. So we need to also work outside of sex and in developing communication within the relationship. And there are a few practices. I can't remember which practices I shared at the talk, but again, this is what I have all throughout my book, that I've got a whole chapter on communication. And we might do things like the I want game. So they sit down and then they sort of ping pong back and forth, just sharing a want. Their partner isn't going to respond, say yes or no. Of course, they can be human and laugh or give cues, but it's not about getting a yes or no. It's just about being able to identify a want and sharing it. And often I think what happens with this is, because having a want is incredibly vulnerable, when someone says, what do you want? Everyone, what I've noticed, feels a lot of pressure to answer straight away. So what we start doing is taking a moment to just notice. And instead of needing an answer straight away, you observe in your body, what do I want? What would feel nice for my body? You don't need to answer straight away. You should be taking time and resisting the urge to be like rapid and quick and move through it at a fast pace. And just getting comfortable with that. And then we might do a few other things like a bossy massage, which is, and these are all things I'd set them for homework, but like, it's okay. I have one person is giving and one person is receiving, and the person who is giving will not touch them unless the person asks for it. And so person A may say, can you please rub your fingers through my hair? And if the giver is willing to do that, they will do that, but they'll only do it for 3 breaths, and then they'll move away and they won't touch the body until there is a request made. So the reason why this is a really useful game is because if it's not the most mind-blowing thing, but you were just kind of curious about it, then it's, 3 breaths. Of course, you can ask to stop at any point, but it's taking the pressure away of that needing to be like lead to orgasm. And it also supports people in being able to be curious and playful and feel into their body. And then there are a whole range of other sort of more directive things. And sometimes what I might do is actually just give people a few questions, really specific questions or really specific statements. And that is, I think, because sexual communication is like learning a new language. And once they have a few basic questions to ask, then they can kind of make them their own. But I think that often the things that I hear are people saying, I just do not know how to ask it this in a way that is sexy or open or kind. So yeah, it was interesting. And I have this case study in the book, but one time I was working with a couple, and the woman, she said, I feel really uncomfortable when you're going down on me because I don't know whether you like it. I feel shame. I feel like there's something wrong with my genitals. And he said, yeah, I don't mind. And in that moment, I could see her shame and her disappointment and like all of her fears come about. And but I was getting really curious about this response. And we stayed with him for a bit, and it turned out that he actually loved going down on her. He actually found so much pleasure and so much sensation, and he loved being in the giving role, and he loved watching her experience pleasure. But he said he felt like a creep because he was enjoying it so much. So once we figured out that he was saying things like, yeah, it's fine, I don't mind, and actually he could own it and he could say, I love it, it's the best thing, I love the way you taste, I love the way you feel,
Mm-hmm.
He was able to voice it, and she was able to get the information she needed so that she could release as
Mm.
well.
So interesting. Yeah, because you often think about the person being able to, voice their fears, but you don't think about actually what's stopping someone from giving an honest answer back as well. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. And
Hmm.
and I think that that's when what we hear a lot is that we can feel wrong from enjoying someone's body.
Mm.
And we're not sure whether we're allowed to touch someone else for our pleasure. But that's the really special thing about sex, is that you can't just go up to a stranger and touch their body for your
Hmm.
pleasure. But if you're consenting, if everyone's excited about being there, you can touch someone's body for your pleasure. And
Hmm.
it can also feel good for that person who's being touched, knowing that this person finds you really hot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes me realize how much there can be a lot of like guessing games and like imagining what the other person's thinking, or, just taking for fact your thoughts about what they're thinking in your own head. And yeah, would really actually, that communication can open up so much. Just hearing, actually what is that person experiencing can open up a whole new door, and suddenly someone can let go, not feel as anxious or. Mhm.
Yes. Yeah, totally. And I'm sure you see that all the time too when you're working.
Mm,
Like all of the things that are unsaid, and these
mhm,
moments where you start talking about it, talking about the things that feel like the taboo is the most important thing for bringing you together.
mhm. I don't know if you've seen this, but I also have, people when they're going on dating and it's the early stages of dating, that they might have these ideas of kind of rules
Mm-hmm.
where, third date, or, then, I have to have sex, or I can't have sex because it's earlier, in the dating, or I've, the date has been at someone's house, we watch Netflix, so therefore, maybe sex has to be on the cards. Kind of these
Mm-hmm.
unsaid kind of rules or pressures that also can get put on themselves. Have you come across
Yes.
that? Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's so interesting how um these ideas that, again, like I think a lot of us learnt from stories or pop culture or the sealed section in glossy mags, like don't have sex until, I can't remember the exact, like, but don't have sex for the first 5 dates if you want to be wife material. Or
Mm-hmm.
um yeah, if you go back to someone's house for a cup of tea, then that means you have to have sex. And
Mm.
I think that, that second one is obviously really distressing for a lot of people, because it it falls into like the questions around consent, of course, like,
Mm-hmm.
and the pressure that we may put on others, um, or even ourselves when it comes to having sex. And I think, like, I always want to understand these and examine them and challenge them.
Mm.
These rules, oh, sorry.
Before we jump into that, could you give the listeners a description of consent? Because I know someone gave a really great description at the talk at UNSW, and I think it might just be helpful for people to hear how you describe it as well.
Yeah, great. That's a great question. So I would define consent as the verbal and non-verbal communication that ensures that everyone is willing or wanting to be there. They are free to leave or free to stop whatever they're doing whenever they want. They are an adult. They are not under the influence of alcohol or drugs. And what we're seeing is a new definition of consent emerge, which is looking at enthusiastic consent.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really important, because it puts the uh, responsibility on all people involved to get an affirmative yes, rather
Mm.
than asking questions like, did you say a no?
Mm.
So we, especially when it looks at sexual assault or rape,
Mm-hmm.
often we all grew up with messaging which is like, just say no, or why didn't you say no? But that doesn't take into account the freeze response or the fawn
Mm.
response.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that puts the responsibility on the victim or the survivor rather than on the perpetrator.
Mm-hmm.
But sorry, I kind of went on a bit of a tangent there. But when I'm thinking about consent, I'm really thinking about it as empathy. Like,
Mm,
you don't have to be in love with this person. It can be a one night stand. You could have no loving feelings towards them, but you will be experiencing emotion. And
mm,
this emotion could be, you know, excitement or lust. It doesn't need to be love, but you will feel emotion because we feel emotions as
mhm,
human beings. And if you were going to have sex with someone, even if you've known them for 15 seconds, they we need to treat these people with empathy.
mm,
And if we can see consent as empathy, and if we can think, I just want to make sure that this person wants to be here as much as I want to be here, then like that I think is the most simple the
mm,
most
mhm.
simple form of consent education. But I guess I'm interested because I know that a lot of your work is trauma informed. When someone asks you about the freeze and fawn response, especially when it comes to like sex or saying no or communicating, how would you talk people through it?
I, the first bit of information I really like to share with people is that when we have fight, flight, freeze, that's an automatic response. We don't have conscious control which gets activated. And I think people can have a lot of shame of, after the fact, or like, why did I freeze? Or why did that happen? Wish that I did something different. But that was actually, your nervous system, your body, your amygdala choosing this feels the safest at the moment to do. And, it overrides your cognitive processing. And that's your nervous system, your body trying to keep you safe.
Yeah, and I really love your use of the language like it's an automatic response
Mm-hmm.
because yeah, that is the theme that comes up where people are like, why didn't I move, or why didn't I run, or why didn't I fight back?
Mm-hmm.
And I even had this the other day. I was like walking down the street and there was someone who my body perceived as being very threatening. They were
Mm-hmm.
a lot bigger than me. They had very aggressive movements in their body. And I didn't even uh, cognitively or rationally clock them, but I
Mm-hmm.
felt my body stiffen and
Mm-hmm.
freeze. And then I felt myself go into the fawn response, which was I smiled at them and
Mm-hmm.
I tried to sort of be like appease them and be gentle with them. And I was like, that is so interesting. The two processes
Mm-hmm.
I just went through, but I was really scared actually. And I could
Mm-hmm.
feel the fear in my body. And um yeah, I really understand when people will feel ashamed of that because they're like, rationally, just run away.
Mm-hmm.
Rationally, tell them to fuck off. but
Mm-hmm.
but sometimes we can't control it.
Yes. I can actually relate to that recently as well. I was on a tram and, there was some people coming from a football game and they're a little bit drunk. And one person kind of sat next to me, was like chatting. It was a little bit annoying, but I noticed myself just go straight into like smiling or just laughing at a joke, even though I didn't find it funny. And I got off the tram. I was like, wow, I remember that happening a lot more in my 20s. And it was interesting that I still found that automatic response to appease.
Yes.
Yeah, when you're confronted in those situations. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Which is why I think the fawn response, it's so important for us to understand that when it comes to sex, because we yeah, like if we're not being really active in creating a safe environment where someone feels like they can say no or pause or ask to slow down, they may feel like they have to engage in something to stay
Mm-hmm.
safe.
And I can see where that the game that you're talking about, where it's 3 seconds, breath of, doing emotion and then pausing and then not doing anything till the person, requests. I can see how that really comes into play here. That really
Yeah.
teaches people to, you know, not just kind of dive into it. And if it really gets people to know actually this person is saying a very enthusiastic yes and we're both in it, and yeah, it really creates that environment both people can actually enjoy it even more.
Yes. Yeah, of course. Because I also work with a lot of people who are in a couple where
Mm-hmm.
someone is living with trauma or working with trauma and the other person is not. And when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to sex, the person who is not living or working with trauma feels like they don't want to, quote unquote, re traumatize or make
Mm-hmm.
their partner feel uncomfortable, but they may have these freeze or fawn responses. And
Mm.
they're trying to figure out how to create that safe environment for sex. And there are certain things that we do, which is like you look for cues, or you might have safe words, or you might practice slowing down. We normalize pausing, and that it's okay to pause and stop. And that's what all sex should have, pauses and stops in it,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's just like adding lube or changing the position. Um, then we also really do normalize the fact that if someone's going to have a trauma response, they're going to have a trauma response. And that
Mm.
doesn't necessarily mean that you've done it. It just might mean that sex is still quite a triggering thing for them. And it doesn't mean you're an unsafe partner. It
Mm-hmm.
just means that if someone's traumatized, they will have a trauma response. So like
Mm.
creating that safety there. But a lot of the time it's also for the partner who isn't living with trauma, they need to be able to trust that their partner can advocate for themselves. Because
Mm.
I notice how they start pulling away and they're like, I'm
Mm.
not going to initiate sex because I don't want to pressure them. So they
Mm-hmm.
start pulling away. And the other partner will be like, I don't want them to not
Mm.
initiate. So yeah, it's complex, but that's why often I think practicing outside of sex is the best place to start.
Yeah. I often like the analogy of the iceberg metaphor,
Mm.
where you have, 10% of the iceberg is above the water and 90% is below the water.
Mm.
And sometimes we can get an emotion or a, nervous system response triggered from the
Mm.
present moment. So maybe it's, a certain way someone touched the other person's body, it triggers, it reminds them of a different situation in the past. And, maybe the freeze response comes up and part of it, is 10% is the present moment. Like someone might, pause or, oh, that was unexpected. But the intensity of the response, both people are confused, like, oh, why was it so intense in this situation, the present day? And usually that's because it's triggering the bottom of the iceberg that you can't see underneath the water. And yeah, just being able to know, oh, that's what's going on. And because often people are like, oh, it doesn't make sense, or I'm over the top, or my emotions are too big. When actually, if you put the puzzle pieces together, it does make sense if you look at it in the context of the past or the context of the memories that come with that. Um, like I recently was on a bushwalk and I had my baby daughter on the carrier and I came across a snake in the middle of the path. And yeah, terrifying.
Were you at the front walking?
I was, yeah, so I had her no, I had her on the front of me
Yeah.
and then yeah, it was just me walking with her. So alone in
Oh,
the bush, came across a snake, and I had just been on a phone call where I wasn't paying much attention. So I was so glad I got off the phone call so I could actually notice the snake and didn't just step on it.
yeah.
Um, and I had to, wait 15 minutes stamping my foot to get those vibrations to get the snake to move away. And I still had like 15 minutes left of the bushwalk, and I was on hyper alert.
Yes.
Every stick, every, crack of a twig from a bird or something like that, I was flinching, I was jumping, I was just on edge.
Mm.
And, that's the iceberg effect where, maybe if you just suddenly see a shadow or a flicker, you might have a little bit of like, oh, wondering
Mm.
what that is. But I went into full panic mode. And that was
Mm.
because it was reminding me of the snake and like, feeling like a real present danger. And yeah,
Yeah.
that can also happen in sex where you can get a really intense response and part of it might be in the present, but it also might be triggering the bottom of that iceberg or the past experiences.
Yes, yeah, and those triggers could be like certain positions or certain
Mm,
words or certain times of the day. And what we might do is find a way to remove those things. So a lot of people will say, I don't have sex in this very specific way because it reminds me of the past. I don't engage in these types of sex, and I don't like this kind of language being used. Then some people will also say, I actually want to develop a safer relationship with that position because I actually really like it and I want to develop being able to have sex at night. So then we might sort of slowly move towards that. And we kind of call this like the learning edge, where we create the context of safety. We've worked on consent. We've worked on communication. We've worked on focusing on pleasure, self-regulation, co-regulation, all of these things. And then we might move towards this thing that is like, yeah, that feels like a new learning spot. So, you know, we might do it outside of a sexual context first, and then we might do it, and it's not sexual, but our clothes are off, and we might only do it for a minute and then step out and pause. And we're just kind of like thinking about what are these sort of smaller, accessible moments that are essentially rewiring the neural pathways around that thing that was once scary and unsafe, but here, body, now this is safe and this is pleasurable, and it isn't the same as the past.
Yeah, recently, you know, I was hearing about neuroplasticity and someone described it that it's really hard to just undo a neural pathway from a brain, to like just erase it and say, I don't want to think of that or have that response again. But what we can do more easily is to add new learning, and gradually you get a, you know, like a different pathway, a different slippery slide that you go down. And, you know, then that old pathway becomes a bit more overgrown and more, you know, not as well trodden. And then, you know, you can more easily go down the new pathway that you're wanting.
Oh, that's such a great way to put it. I'll use that and credit you.
Well, we're almost out of time. Thank you so much, Georgia. Do you have, you know, any final kind of tips or anything you want to say to the listeners before we finish up?
I think that the one thing that I'm really thinking about at the moment is the pressure that we place on ourselves around being an expert. And it's particularly like comes up when it comes to sex. And I've already touched on this, but I think it's an important point. And we expect that because sex is this idea that we think like when you love someone or when you like someone or you're attracted to them, the sex should just feel natural. It should feel easy. You should want it at the exact same time. You should want the exact same thing. But that's just not the case. Like that's not how sex works. It's not how sexuality is experienced. It's not how desire works either. So often I think when we can remove the pressure of needing to be an expert and instead come back to this idea that sex is every single time a co-created experience if you're having sex with someone else. And if we can start to see it as something that we're co-creating and something that we're experiencing together, it takes the pressure off that person needing to know exactly what the other person needs and exactly what they need, and instead say, okay, but what feels good in this moment? And sometimes that might be a sensual massage or neck kisses or dry humping or washing each other's bodies in the shower, and it might never involve naked penetration. But all of those things are sex, and all of those things can be a part of a very healthy and fulfilling sex life. So remove the pressure of needing to be an expert sex lord and instead just come back to what feels good. And if you need support with that, I've got a whole book that will help you.
Amazing. And I'm going to pop a link to that in the episode show notes. If someone wants to find out more about you, where can they find you? Do you have a website?
Yes, I do have a website. So my first name is Georgia. My last name is Grace. And you can just Google georgiagrace.co. And I have an Instagram, which is called G-Spot. And there I share sex ed and ideas. I have a podcast. And if anyone wants a sex toy, they could also go to itsnormal.com. We've got heaps of sex ed and videos there. But we've also got some really great sex toys as well. So yeah, you can check that out.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to release this episode. I know it's going to be so helpful for so many people. And yeah, really appreciate your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thanks for having me. I am a big fan of your work. So yeah, I was really happy to come on.